In a time of profound social and cultural change, an entire generation of young Americans stood united in their desire for more powerful cars, fueling the greatest horsepower war in automotive history. Screeching rubber through turns, roaring down back streets and country lanes, were fun-loving drivers in their wild and powerful dream machines. Just about anyone could afford to fly down the road in a boldly styled, attention-grabbing American icon, the muscle car. Hello, I'm Chip Foose. We're at the Dow Corp Racing facility just outside Los Angeles. The early 1960s were a chaotic time in American history, no less so for the heart of the country's industrial base, the big three automakers. After the stylistic excesses of the 1950s, Detroit was on the verge of tapping into a completely new marketplace. And 1964 was the year that performance arrived in a big way on driveways and drag strips across the country. It was a perfect storm of demographics, economics, marketing, and raw horsepower. Once Detroit opened Pandora's box, the automotive industry would be forever changed.
It's Sunday, the day of the big race.
As the 60s dawned, the big three were retreating from factory-supported racing by mutual agreement. In fact, General Motors instituted regulations banning high-horsepower mid-size cars. But the public's thirst for performance grew unchecked as powerful engines became more abundant and more cheaply produced. The days of performance as a luxury item were coming to an end.
Prior to 1964, General Motors marketed performance, but it was more of a gentleman's performance. It was for the high-income people who could afford 421 cubic inches in their Pontiacs just to go racing.
But performance was about to come to the people in a big way. Contrary to General Motors' official policy, a group of forward-thinking executives and engineers at Pontiac were prepared to defy their bosses to create a car unlike anything ever produced on a Detroit assembly line. These men developed a plan, taking the heretofore well-regarded but underpowered Pontiac Tempest and giving it more horsepower than they were technically allowed to give.
And it was Bill Collins, as a matter of fact, the chassis guy, who said to DeLorean, "You know, John, it would only take about a half an hour for us to stick a 389 in this car that was scheduled to accept a 326. Well, that gave a birth to an idea that ultimately ended up being called the GTO. We were smart enough to see that if this car was successful, it was the next stage of development. You know, it was not anything so terribly new or creative, except we did it first. We took an old hot rod trick and put it on the production line and brought out a car that we were building and warranting and guaranteeing. And they gambled with their careers by doing this. They could very easily have been literally called in and said, you know, you broke a rule that you obviously knew about, your career's over.
The name GTO, often credited to John DeLorean, was a specific reference to the famed Ferrari 250 GTO, and while the name didn't sit well with some automotive purists, it struck a chord with the population at large, especially the youth market, towards which Detroit was increasingly turning its eye.
After World War II, youth in America had more money to spend than they had ever had. And what they wanted was to distinguish themselves. They wanted to set themselves apart from the previous generation, and they did pretty handily. Here's a little Pontiac coming along and bringing out a car that was just a Tempest and putting an engine in it far out of proportion to what they were used to seeing under the hood. This is a giant V8, multiple carbs, but really it was all about performance.
The heart of the most desirable GTO option package was GM's throaty 389 cubic inch tri-power V8, sporting 3 two-barrel carburetors and dual exhaust. The GTO also featured a 4-speed manual transmission with Hurst shifter, stiffer springs, and a variety of other performance and appearance enhancements. With 348 horses under the hood of a 3,500-pound car, the GTO had the best power-to-weight ratio of any mid-size production car of 1964. At $4,500 for the full GTO package, the car wasn't cheap, but the resulting public interest would blow away even Pontiac's most optimistic projections.
If they could bring in 5,000 orders and show it to the corporation management, they would be much more sympathetic to saying, well, we don't like what you did, but you've done it, and we can't embarrass you in front of your dealers, so go ahead and build those 5,000, but don't build any more. That was what was anticipated. What we didn't anticipate was, after the car got out, within 1 month, Pontiac had over 15,000 more orders for the car. Obviously, the corporation, as aggressive as they wanted to be when they're looking at this kind of business, they had only one choice. Yeah, go ahead, build it.
The GTO was not only a popular success, but a critical one as well. The entire Pontiac line was recognized by Motor Trend as Car of the Year for 1964, not least due to the impact of the GTO, and it was the third time in 6 years that Pontiac had won the prestigious award.
And the GTO personified in steel, in sheet metal, everything that Pontiac stood for. All of that imaging sort of came together around this car, which stole the hearts of America's young people. And by God, it was a Pontiac.
If you saw headlines every Monday that Chryslers were just sweeping the board, then that got you thinking about Chryslers.
Said that street racing began when the first two guys in the same town pulled up next to each other in their Model Ts. When performance became more of a priority for car builders, the speeds also increased, as did the popularity of street racing. Although street racing has always been a part of car culture, compromising public safety and endangering lives is bad for everyone. Fortunately, this highly dangerous pastime fostered the growth of a safer racing derivative and a new venue for performance cars to flex their muscles.
Well, street racing had a stigma then and now. I mean, obviously police frowned on it. Many of us got arrested. We certainly got a lot of speeding tickets and licenses revoked back then.
Demonstration of speed was typically stoplight to stoplight, and it was not at the highest end high mile an hour part. Too dangerous and takes up too much of a street or too much of a highway.
Decades of street racing prompted the creation of the National Hot Rod Association in 1951. The NHRA was dedicated to getting racers off public streets and onto specially built quarter-mile tracks that came to be known as drag strips. The new sport of drag racing was a success practically from the word go, and by the end of the 50s, drag strips had sprouted up nationwide. While exotic one-off dragsters got the magazine covers, the rising popularity of the NHRA was driven in large part by the classes that featured cars fresh off the showroom floor.
When I was a kid, we used to love watching the dragsters and everything, but when the superstar cars came out on the track, that was the highlight of the whole show for us. And they were super popular there in the early 60s. The dragsters were great. You loved seeing them burn out all the way down the drag strip, but when they bring the production cars out, it's something you could relate to. You could actually go buy one of those cars.
And as drag racing diversified, more and more people chose to run their daily drivers down the quarter mile. With the blizzard of available options for many mid-size and full-size cars of the early 60s, the savvy buyer could go down to the dealership and leave the lot with a car that could pull down respectable ETs on any drag strip.
People could go to the showroom and buy something, and, check the boxes off, either buy something on the showroom floor and/or order something that basically would emulate what the heroes were doing in drag racing that they read about every month in the magazines. Cars looked like the same cars, they sounded like the same cars, and they certainly went like the same cars.
We created a kind of a thing called the weekend warrior, where you'd have a car that you used during the week to go to school, or if you were working, to go to work. And then on the weekends, you'd take it out to the local drag strip. And this became a pretty big attraction, the weekend warrior. But he would kind of play mechanic, tune up, change the carburetor settings, and go out and have a lot of fun.
And for all Detroit's justifiable alarm at the rise of street racing, sanctioned drag racing proved to be an unexpected boom, thanks to the popularity of the new superstock classes.
A lot of the idea behind it was to create publicity for what you were trying to sell. If you saw headlines every Monday that Chryslers were just sweeping the board, then that got you thinking about Chryslers.
So the manufacturers were very proud and happy to see people take their cars to the strip and prove their performance on the track. And it became part of the whole advertising, the whole image and mystique of the muscle car.
In fact, the Big Three began quietly catering to drag racers with cars specifically designed to maximize speed over the quarter mile.
These companies, Ford, Chrysler, GM, they had preferred drivers, preferred teams that they would sell these cars to. They had people that they knew were going to do really well with them and enhance the prestige of their name.
The maximum performance guy wanted the Strip-O car, basically no content to it, delete everything because power to weight.
Detroit had a theme of win on Sunday, sell on Monday. All you had to do was be able to afford the payments. You were instantly in. You had a high-performance car ready to go.
Higher compression, bigger valves, better breathing, just magnificent in the engineering when you think about it.
In the late 1950s, Pontiac got the drop on their competition by introducing wide-track cars whose construction and wheelbase gave them an edge over other stock models in racing competition. But soon the other car companies would catch on to the advantages of selling cars publicized by winning race teams. By the early 60s, General Motors and Ford were facing a stiff challenge from the engineers at Chrysler, who were on the verge of making history with a truly legendary engine.
Chrysler had some very good engineers that were also kind of gearheads. They liked cars that were fast.
Everything else was secondary to performance. They went to the extreme to build the best performance vehicle that they could and kind of ignored the rest of it, like quality and panel fitment and all of that.
We could have an upset. It's Cutter gone in the lead. The Ram Charger's coming on hard. The winner is Cutter gone.
One of Chrysler's significant advantages was its justifiably heralded 426 wedge engine, which allowed even inexperienced drag racers to best their rival.
Anybody with a down payment could grab these cars and take them out and immediately start racing them and be competitive with very minor modifications, if any. That stopped around mid-year '64.
Everything was going along just fine, and then all of a sudden, Chrysler came out with their 426 Hemi. Then things really changed.
When they came out with the race Hemi package, which was never licensed for the street, that was kind of the end of a guy like me going in and buying a car off the showroom.
Originally developed for use in NASCAR, the 426 cubic inch Hemi, so named for its hemispherical heads, was the biggest engine in stock car racing at the time. While the street Hemi was still a couple of years in the future, the race Hemi made an immediate impact.
426 Hemis, legendary. Elephant Motors, that was the nickname. Chrysler Corporation took their engineers and encouraged them to harken back to the 50s days when they were building hemispherical combustion chamber heads, big heads that created great breathing capability and certainly a lot of power. Higher compression, bigger valves, better breathing, just magnificent in the engineering when you think about it at the time.
There was many unique things about the race Hemi, magnesium cross-ram intake manifold, 2 4-barrels, a high compression, and special exhaust headers built from Chrysler, and about 650 horsepower, and with the likes of Ronnie Socks and Dick Landy and the Ram Chargers, just wreaked havoc on the competition.
Eventually, people learned how to carefully tune the massive thrust of the race Hemi for street drag. But back in '64 and '65, the engine was simply too dangerous.
You could not buy a race Hemi off a car lot. We tried it once, and They just said, who do you race for? We said, nobody. Tore up the paper and said, you can leave now. They weren't selling them to the public. It was just too much car.
This new breed of stock drag car, featuring the race Hemi and a variety of modifications intended to reduce vehicle weight, was fearsome on the drag strip. But the changes, made for competitive advantage, illustrated the growing chasm between manageable street cars and race winners.
They came out with an aluminum front end package, which took about 150 pounds off the nose weight of the car. It was all about weight and weight transfer and getting traction. Those cars weren't seen on the street hardly at all.
One successful example of the 1964 factory lightweights was this Dodge Polara 330, which raced under a rather unusual name.
The car raced under Snorkosaurus, and it was actually ordered by Dick Landy when he ordered his 64 race Hemi Dodge. Snorkosaurus kind of sounds familiar to us. That was actually what Dino was called in the Flintstones cartoon. He was a Snorkosaurus. That car has 552 miles on it, and it's just a great piece of preserved history. Mercury actually had put down a ruling that you are not to engage in match racing against the Chryslers. They just were no match for the Hemi.
As powerful as Chrysler's new 426 Hemi was in the quarter mile, it was absolutely devastating in NASCAR. Richard Petty rode his Hemi-equipped Plymouth Belvedere to runaway victories in 1964. Not surprisingly, his dominance was so complete that NASCAR banned the Hemi in 1965, leading to Chrysler boycotting the season in protest. But stock car racing's loss was drag racing's gain, as 1965 saw legendary Hemis dominating at drag strips across the country. As successful as Chrysler's had been in the quarter mile in 1964, the following year, the company made even more resources available to drag racers.
So it wasn't just the engine gets all the light in the Mopar world, but there's a lot of other drivetrain components to the car that they did just keep up with the engines.
The Ram Chargers, of course, they were Dodge engineers.
The candy stripe Ram Chargers Dodge, driven by...
And one thing that they had done to the cars was they moved the rear axle forward 3 inches and actually shifted the fender well so nobody noticed. And they went out and they kept cleaning house the rest of the season because there was more weight over the rear axle. Nobody noticed it.
The Dodge beats the Chevy, and Moser goes into the all-Dodge stock final.
The amount of expertise and money being poured into drag racing ensured that the cars became more and more powerful, and estimated times dropped precipitously.
One thing that was very unique about the factory experimental class is when they first came out for that very first run in Pomona, they were running about 1050, 1060 times. They went from carburetors to Hillborn fuel injection, running on alcohol to running on nitromethane. Within a matter of months' time, they went from running 1060s to running 860s in the same car. That's why the cars were scary, and that's why these drivers are legends today, because there has never been, never will be, a given class inside of 1 year that has accelerated 2 seconds in time. That just makes these guys legends.
Chrysler's flagship drag offerings in 1965 were the Plymouth Belvedere, the same model that propelled Richard Petty to NASCAR glory in '64, and the Dodge Coronet, which replaced the mid-size Polara in the Chrysler product line.
The car behind me, the 65 race Hemi Coronet, that car, you could order it with a slant 6, you could order it with a 383, you could order it with an automatic, a 4-speed, you could order it with a Hemi. You could get it with whatever you wanted back in those days. So that same body style, you could sell it to grandma, or it can be a race car, just by changing the engine.
These 1965 factory lightweights were not only historically important in their own right, but they were precursors to an entirely new breed of drag racer.
65 Plymouth figured out that they could take a brand new production body before they assembled it and dip it in acid to basically reduce the thickness of the metal. The door glass is half thickness. The armrests are deleted from the door panels. The radio was deleted, the ashtray was deleted, the heater was deleted. One windshield wiper on the passenger side was deleted, all in the spirit of winning, all in the spirit of creating the greatest amount of power with the lightest amount of weight in the package as possible.
In full racing trim, the Belvederes and the Coronets were tough to beat on the drag strip.
Mercury actually had put down a ruling that you are not to engage in match racing against the Chryslers. They just were no match for the Hemi.
A very limited number of Hemi-equipped Belvederes and Coronets were built in 1965, making them some of the rare muscle car variants of the era.
65 Dodge was the last of the real race Hemis. When some of the other manufacturers were pulling out of racing, Chrysler and even Ford still were at it heavy.
In the years to come, car companies would offer a wide array of style and performance enhancements, with big block engines, race graphics, and aerodynamic styling. However, two of the most iconic machines in automotive history remain the 1964 Pontiac GTO and Chrysler's 426 Hemi engine. Each paved the way for a decade-long flood of great American muscle cars. From Dalcorp Racing, I'm Chip Foose, and I'll see you next time on America. In a time of profound social and cultural change, an entire generation of young Americans stood united in their desire for more powerful cars, fueling the greatest horsepower war in automotive history. Screeching rubber through turns, roaring down back streets and country lanes, were fun-loving drivers in their wild and powerful